Hello, and welcome to the season one finale of the Bible Passages podcast. John and I have been blown away by the response to the podcast, and it really has encouraged us to continue on our work to create more free Bible content and specifically Bible geography content. It's only through your support that we can continue to deliver free Bible content. I don't necessarily mean monetary support, although that's something we definitely need. Your comments, direct messages, likes, and shares encourage us to keep going in our work. If you're new to the podcast and haven't liked or subscribed yet, it would mean so much to us if you would. Additionally, if you don't know about Bible passages, you can find much more free content related to the land of the Bible at our website, BiblePassages.net. However you got here, John and I just wanted to take a minute and say thank you for your support of season one, and we're looking forward to many more. Welcome to the Bible Passages podcast.
It's a seaport city in terms of trade. It's an administrative center where a lot of important things are going to happen on governmentally. It's a larger city that's really developed now.
Located on the narrow strip of land separating the Aegean and the Adriatic, ancient Corinth was one of the most important cities in ancient times.
The Romans devised a way where they could pull ships across that little small isthmus there, and thus save time and effort, and thus give people an opportunity to trade.
It is, perhaps, most well known for the two letters the Apostle Paul wrote to the church.
They've gone to Philippi, to Thessalonica, to Berea, to Athens, and Paul now arrives at Corinth.
Knowing that they are struggling with sin, division, and pagan worship, Paul draws on the images of their culture to encourage them to live out their higher calling.
Paul uses some of those objects to drive home the point about various spiritual principles and thoughts. Even the Apostle John in the book of Revelation speaks about the bowls of wrath being poured out.
We hope you'll enjoy this episode of the Bible Passages podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Bible Passages podcast. We're so excited that you've decided to join us today. We are here to help you develop and sustain your faith through connections that can be made with the Bible. And I'm here, as usual, with John Moore. How are things going today, John?
Hey, Brian, everything's going great. It's wonderful. How about you?
It's going very well. I feel like we talk about the weather. Maybe that's like that progressive commercial. I'm becoming like my parents, but
Yeah.
we are anticipating a cold snap this weekend. It will be 7 below in Denver for a couple of days. So
Well, it's
going to be
the thing that
chilly.
affects us the most on a daily basis, right? So it's easy to kind of want to talk about.
That's right.
Yeah. But
But
no, yeah, things are going good, and I know that you guys are excited. How many more months before the big day?
we're down to weeks now. I think we've got 7 more weeks. That is another thing. My mother-in-law is here, and my mother comes in today. So we've got a full house and baby shower on Sunday. So lots of fun stuff going
Yeah.
on in our life.
Well, so maybe it turned out well that you could kind of do this podcast. You can retreat and get away from them all, right?
Yeah. Well, and we're early enough in the morning. Nobody's really wants to be here.
Yeah.
So, John, as we get started, I have a question. Have you ever been somewhere where you didn't know the local culture or maybe made a cultural mistake?
Well, probably a lot of different situation scenarios. You had sent me that ahead of time, and I was just thinking, man, I don't, which one do I choose? But I will tell you one that got me into a little bit of trouble. When I say trouble, it was embarrassing and kind of frightening to me. But back in 1998, the first time I visited Jerusalem, went there to enroll in a class there at Jerusalem University College, and so it was my very first time to travel that far away from home, and picked up at an airport in Beirut. And so they drop off, different people, and along the way you share a taxi with others. And so we were second to the last stop, and it was the middle of the night. Taxi driver that doesn't speak English gets out, gets our luggage out, and points us to the hotel in the old Jerusalem city, and walk up there. And of course, we were going to stay there over a month, so I had all this luggage. And anyway, got to inside the hotel and realized I didn't have a bag. And there was the guy that let us in had already gone back to bed. And so the next day they tell us to go, how to find out if my luggage is still in that taxi cab. And thankfully we had an honest taxi cab driver, and they did have it at that place, but I had to take a cab near Jaffa Gate over to this, taxi cab center, and so I asked the guy at the hotel, how much is it going to cost to do a cab, and he said, well, 40 shekels should be fine to get you there and back. Well, I got into the cab, and before I got in, I told the guy, I said, how much to go to such and such place, and he said 40 shekels. I said, okay, great. And so I get in, but thankfully my bag is there. I was so thankful. Came back almost to the Jaffa Gate, and he said, "That'll be 80 shekels." And I said, "No, you said 40." He goes, "No, 40 there and 40 back." And I was like, "No, no." And he started getting mad at me because I wasn't going to pay him, and it kind of got me all flustered and everything because I didn't really know what it really cost. I didn't know, really the proper procedures for negotiating and all that kind of stuff. And uh, and so he got me all flustered. So I said, "All right, I'll give you 60." And as I walk away from the cab, I'm going back to the hotel. This guy yells at me, "Hey, you forgot your bag." So I left after all of that to go get my bag. I was so flustered. I left my bag in the back seat of that car, and everything. So I think he was like, "Wow, what a dumb tourist! He doesn't know how to get around. He doesn't even know what he's thinking." And I was really embarrassed and frustrated. So anyway, that's my story.
So I have kind of two stories about that. One, we were in the Virgin Islands, and they drive on the left side of the car, but they drive also on the left side of the road. So that was an interesting thing, and I didn't hit anybody, fortunately. But Shannon, every time we went somewhere, Shannon would be like, "Stay left, stay left, stay left," trying to make
Yeah.
sure. But they were hit with 2 Category 5 earthquake or, hurricanes back to back, and so they didn't really have any stoplights, and so what I figured out culturally is that they honked to express every emotion that could ever come to
Yeah.
a person. They honked when they were happy, they honked when they were mad, they honked to turn, they honked to stop, they honked to go. It was just every time you went somewhere, somebody was honking at you, so that was a little bit interesting, but I also have a story from our tour.
Did you honk
um
back? Did you honk back?
no, I did not participate in the
Oh,
honking.
come on.
Uh, but the story from our tour, you were there and we were there. I think I've said before on the podcast, but if not, you'll hear me again. One of my favorite things that's somewhat incidental to the tour, but is also a big part of what we do is when we're there over a Sunday, we try to worship at a congregation that's local to the country we're in. So, and this particular occasion, we were in Rome and we had a group in Rome, and Wayne Jones was preaching. And of course, most of the people in Rome speak Italian, so he's going to speak with a translator. And he's going along and he's talking in English, and the translator's talking in Italian, and he'd say something in English, and the translator would say something in Italian. Well, he got to an illustration in his sermon and said that it was like cowboys and Indians. And the translator goes along in Italian, and then he kind of pauses for a second and goes, "Cowboys and Indians." So Wayne said, "You mean you don't have a word for cowboys and Indians?"
Yeah, yeah,
And that was kind of interesting, but culture it's incredible how that plays into everything that goes on in our life. I don't know if you've been in a situation like Wayne. I have used an idiom, speaking in a foreign country that's just not going to work. They have, I'll say it's just like 4th of July, and they have no idea what 4th of
yeah,
July
yeah. Or you're way out in left field. I did that in the
is.
summer one time in Jamaica, talking about baseball, and they were all like, "What does that mean?" Left field, yeah.
Well, and the reason, we started there today, we're talking about Corinth, of course, today. And I don't know how you feel, but I think when I was thinking about Corinth, no other book has more cultural implications. And, I don't know if you wrestle with this, but the Bible transcends culture, right? So the book that was written to Corinth is still applicable in our culture, in our day, and that kind of thing. But when you read it, it does seem like Paul is playing off of more cultural information than he is in any other book. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of connections, and hopefully we'll get to share some of those today. But and then even some controversial stuff, that as far as what is the culture really like, like for example, Aphrodite and the temple, worship there, and the kind of the prevailing view has been a lot that there was this cult practice of these prostitutes giving themselves. But then I read in the secondary literature, no, that's not necessarily the case. One author said that, and so anyway, but yeah, I mean, trying to figure out the culture, but there is some that is just so obvious that the more you appreciate it, the better you're going to appreciate things that Paul said.
Yeah, and I, it's one of the things that I think you and I like to do, right, is dig into the culture of a place, try to dig in to figure out what's going on there at the time. As we kind of get started, the plan is we'll talk about the geography for a second, and then I think we'll walk through Acts 18 and talk about what it says there and what we can find actually at the site. And then one thing I want to say out of the gate is this is a place like Ephesus to me. There's so much to uncover. I feel like, or Laodicea in Turkey. There's just so much that can be uncovered. So I don't know how much we'll get to, but let's start a little bit with the geography. John, what are the important geographic features that we need to know about Corinth?
Yeah, I think just to sum it up, it's on this isthmus, right? This little land bridge between the northern part of Greece and then the Peloponnese to the south. So the Greek mainland to the north, and then so right there, you're on this little small land bridge. On one side is um, the Gulf of Corinth, and then the other side was the Aegean Sea and the Adriatic Sea, and so you're right there in between. So it was poised in a very significant, geographically important place to accommodate trade. And instead of having for sailors to sail all the way around the southern end of the Peloponnese, there you could save some time by going through what today there is a canal, right? There's a natural canal, but in the ancient Roman times, they tried a canal there. I think that the Greeks did early on, and then it just didn't work out. So the Romans devised a way where they could pull ships across that little small isthmus there, and and thus save time and effort, and thus give people an opportunity to trade. So, and when we were there, I'd read about that all of my life and studying through the Corinthian letters and the Book of Acts, and you talk about that, and that it's a seaport city, and thus that probably was sort of like the San Francisco of the ancient world, and yet when you drive there, Brian, do you remember when you first kind of come up on that? It really has an impact. That was the first thing that impacted me geographically when I saw, yeah, I can see these different bodies of water on either side. That this isthmus is very small, and now it really is stuck in my mind about where this is located and why it's so important.
Yeah, and it is pretty impressive. You think of actually, it's made news recently. Donald Trump has made some remarks about the Panama Canal and how he would like to bring that back under American control. But it's very important to think about how much time and how much treachery, for lack of a better term, how much danger this cut out of a journey. To sail around that Grecian peninsula was going to be time consuming and much more dangerous than it was just to get over this teeny tiny little land bridge. And it is very, very cool. I want to talk just briefly about the attempts to put canals in there because I read something, and full disclosure, I did not double check it, but apparently one of the emperors who really wanted a canal there consulted with some engineers from Egypt, and of course, Egypt was known to have a lot of skilled labor in that department, and apparently, the report he got back is that one side, and I can't remember. I think the Syncria side was higher than the other town, and so their report was that if he dug a canal, that it would flood all of Greece. I don't know that
Yeah.
that's exactly right, but one author did write that that was the report that he got back. So, um, anyway, so if this is such an important place, it stands to reason that Corinth is going to be an important city. So, if you're transporting either goods or a ship over this tiny strip of land, and there's a controlling city there, kind of like Istanbul or Troy in years gone by, right there on the Isthmus, the Bosporus, and the Dardanelles. If there's a city there, they can control the trade there. So there was a tax to bring your goods across the isthmus, and a lot of that money flowed into Corinth. So there's a lot of money in that area, and also, um, you know, I don't know if we're ever going to get dinged for uh, being disparaging against sailors, John, but
Yeah,
they had a little bit of a reputation,
yeah.
and their reputation is being a little rough around the edges. So, the things that typically appeal to sailors, like opportunities for prostitution or for debauchery or something like that, well, when there's money to be made and there's clients to be found, there's often those things as well. So Corinth had quite the reputation. I don't know, some one author wrote, and I've seen it several places, that it had such a reputation that if you wanted to slander somebody, particularly a woman, you could call them a Corinthian girl, and everybody knew that that meant she had a loose reputation. So, uh, kind of a, an issue there. So, you have any more about the geography or the
The only other
reputation?
thing I would mention is that we need to remember that during the classical Greek period, Athens was sort of the iconic place. But by the time that Paul comes here, remember now this area is under the control of the Roman Empire. Corinth becomes the administrative center of this region, and it's a part of Achaia there, this province in the south, and then Macedonia province to the north. But Athens and Corinth and Delphi are all in this province to the south, with Corinth being that main place, and where the proconsul Gallio is going to be and take up residence that we'll get to a little bit later on. So yeah, think of it as an important city in terms of its seaport. It's a seaport city in terms of trade. It's an administrative center where a lot of important things are going to happen on governmentally. It's a larger city that's really developed now, that after the Greek city had been destroyed, laid, I think, somewhat vacant for close to 100 years, I believe, and then is rebuilt by the Romans. And so definitely a Roman city with Greek influences, obviously. But so yeah, an important place for the Apostle Paul to go, and a place where he's going to spend a great deal of time.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that last part. So we've talked in previous episodes about how Greek cities become Roman cities. Corinth does follow that mold, but because of how long it was between it was a Greek when it was a Greek city and when it was a Roman city, Corinth is more Roman than it is Greek. It's maybe more Roman than any other city in Greece. And one of the resources I wrote said that, or read, said that 104 out of the 110 inscriptions that have been found are in Latin, and that is
Mhm.
unique to Corinth. So we're going to talk about the Erastus inscription in a second, but it's in Latin. Well, if you go to places like Ephesus, which is in Turkey, everything's in Greek. Or you go to, of course, cities in Greek. A lot of them are still in Greece.
Yeah,
In
or both,
cities in
right? Yeah. Mhm.
Greece, they're still in Greek.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, but this Greek city, most of the inscriptions are in Latin, and so that's kind of a an interesting tidbit. Um, let's go ahead and jump into Acts 18, and I don't want to go, super in depth, but I want to go through a bit of this text and kind of talk about the things that we can find as we go through. The first thing is 18 starts with, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. So John, you want to talk a little bit about the journey Paul has taken to get to Corinth?
Yeah. So if you're going through your New Testament, the Book of Acts, remember Luke is chronicling for us the history, the development of the early church, and the work of God's Spirit in establishing this work. Um, and so the church at Antioch sends Paul and Barnabas out on journeys. And so that first journey that we've talked about is going to primarily focus on the island of Cyprus and then the Asia Minor area. But the second journey, where Paul now and Barnabas separate, Paul comes with Luke and others, and they come over to the region of Macedonia. They've gone to to Philippi, to Thessalonica, to Berea, to Athens. And as you're then progressing through the book of Acts, we come to chapter 18, and Paul now arrives at Corinth, and when he does, he's going to meet Aquila and Priscilla there, and end up working together as a tent maker for them and with them for a while until Timothy and Silas arrive from the southern part of Greece, the province of Macedonia, and bring support from the church at Philippi and perhaps others, but to help Paul so that then he can devote himself, more fully to the work there. But yeah, that's kind of where we are, right in the heart of this second missionary tour, somewhere around 51 AD. Okay, and maybe later on we could talk about how we even know that, right?
Yeah, I did want to ask. So, and I'm pretty sure I have this right, but Thessalonica and Corinth, the report that is brought to Paul while he's here is in part what Paul is talking about in his letter to Thessalonians, right? He says, I was so anxious to hear about you and your faith and about how everything. Well, we get in this section of scripture where he gets that report and then presumably where he writes that letter. So he writes it and he sends it back with them. So that's very cool. I want to
Yeah,
talk.
which is a great reminder. Again, is by way of application that you go to a work and you don't forget about it. Paul was still very concerned, and so he gets this letter, like you said. So think of Corinth as being a place not only where he's going to go to evangelize, but it's going to be a central hub for the sending out of letters. He's going to continue to stay in contact with the church at Corinth when he goes to Ephesus, and yeah, point well taken. Good.
Well, and I want to talk a little bit about Aquila and Priscilla. And I really, part of me wants to get into this and talk about it for the next hour. And part of me knows that nobody cares but me. But if you trace where Aquila and Priscilla show up in scripture, you get hints of some world events that are coming on or going on, rather. And Corinth actually has more ties. I said it has more cultural ties, but I think it also has more ties to world events because we get to figure out specific dates and specific things that are going on, kind of as you mentioned. But why are Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth? It says because that the emperor kicked all the Jews out of Rome. Basically, I'm paraphrasing. That event is known as the Edict of Claudius, and it could be the occasion for writing the Roman letter. So what happens is all these Jews are in Rome, and there's a church there, and we're not 1,000% sure how the church in Rome gets established, but presumably it's primarily Jew and a little bit Gentile. Well, then Claudius says, kind of gets aggravated at the Jews and sends all of them away from Rome. And so Aquila and Priscilla end up in Corinth, and we get that reference in Acts. But what happens to the Roman church? It's maybe the first church that's entirely Gentile. Or if it's not, it's one of the very first churches that is entirely Gentile. There's no Jews there. Well, after Claudius dies, the next emperor allows the Jews to come back, and the Jews come back into Rome. And what they find is a church that looks culturally different than the one they left. And that could be the occasion for Paul to write such a in-depth letter about the law and the relationship with the Gentiles and the relationship with the Jews and the situation that's going there in Rome. So, John, if you have anything to add, go ahead. But I could
No,
talk
just
about
that.
that all
The
day.
only thing I would add is just again what all took place at Corinth. So many things, and although we can't say 100% for certain, I think we could probably 99% certain say that the letter of Romans was written from Corinth during Paul's third missionary journey. So he's going to come back to Corinth a little bit later on, and the reason we know that is because at the end of the letter he mentions various people that are definitely tied to Corinth, and then even Phoebe, who's probably going to be the one that carries the letter there. So yeah, Corinth is just a, I mean, and it makes sense too to think about what we've already talked about, it being an administrative center of the area, people coming and going, ease of access to the western part of Italy, and then cut across there the Gulf, I mean the Isthmus to get over to Ephesus, and so this is a part of real world, a real time, real geographic locations. This is a part of history that we're talking about.
Yeah, and so Aquila and Priscilla, again, if you kind of trace where they end up, because they end up in a couple of different places in a couple of different letters.
Yeah.
Um, the text specifically says, we'll get down to it in a second, but the text in Corinthians is also interesting because we're given pretty specific time frames. And what I mean by that is it says that Paul stayed here a year and 6 months. And I think one of the things that we sometimes forget is it only, Acts 18, it's not even all of Acts 18, he's in Corinth. And we read that one chapter and we're like, okay, that all happened in a week. And it's like, well, no, these things happened
Hmm.
all over the place. And we'll talk about a discrepancy with the leader of the synagogue here in a second. And so, how can Aquila and Priscilla be in Rome and be in Corinth and be elsewhere? Well, they're allowed to move over the span of many years.
Yeah.
So, it's sometimes hard to remember that these things happened over a long period of time.
Yeah.
One more thing about Aquila and Priscilla, text says they were tent makers. John, why do we need tents in a urban city?
Yeah, in fact, there's a criticism that has been levied against the Bible by a few, not many, that what in the world is Paul there and making tents for? This is not a nomadic area of sheep herders. This is a highly sophisticated city. Um, well, two reasons why you need tent makers or people who work with cloth and make big fabrics and sew things together, right? And one is because of the sails that are needed for ships. This is a seaport city. And the second thing is as way by of another connection with, you mentioned connections about what we read or what we know about culturally is happening and what we read in the Bible and things that Paul makes reference to in the First Corinthian letter, and that is that every 2 years there was a very important athletic competition that occurred there just outside of Corinth, sort of between Corinth and Cenchrea there, at a place where there was a temple to Poseidon, where the Isthmian Games occurred. So you think about, we have our athletic, Olympic Games every 4 years, and then every 2 years as well, there are these what do they call them? The other games where people come together and from around the world, and so that was going on there. So this a number of the Athenians, people of that region for many years had gathered there in honor of Poseidon to have these games. And so historians have told us that when this happened, there wasn't enough room for everybody in the city. They had, many of them dwelt in tents outside of the city or around the city or somewhere, just maybe they needed an Olympic village, like kind of today where the athletes come and stay. So it made perfect sense that, this is going to be a great place to hone your craft and to sell your wares if you're a tent maker.
Well, and I heard one more connection with the sailing ships as well. Of course, if you are a um, sailor, you don't have a place to live in every place that you go. So they would take tents and they would put them on the ship, and then they would use those to stay when they were in other cities that weren't their home city. So,
Yeah.
um, uh, you know, very, I don't want to say valid. It's a good question. Why do we need tents in a city? But it has a very logical explanation when you think about all the things that are happening culturally.
Yeah, and could have been a
Um,
lucrative and very viable means of living. And I think that's probably Aquila and Priscilla. If he worked with them, what do we know about them? The church met in their home in Rome, and the church met at their home in other places. So they were wealthy, and wow, again, there's so many things here. I don't want to get into this, but what kind of home did they live in? It had to be a fairly sizable home, the domus of the Roman world that could accommodate a church meeting in it, and that then explains some of the issues that the church faced at Corinth with regard to their eating in separate places, or not gathering together in a unified way. But anyway, so Aquila and Priscilla, I mean, all this adds up, right? With what we read in the historical record and what we're reading in Scripture, it's like a hand in a glove.
It is. And Aquila and Priscilla also represent one more thing that's important to consider in Paul, and specifically his relationship with the Corinthians. So Paul works full time, or at least enough to support himself, when he's in Corinth. And it's very important to what he says in Second Corinthians, well, even in First Corinthians. But in Second Corinthians, he's trying to defend his apostleship, and he is saying, is it only Barnabas and I that have no right to make a living off the gospel? He's basically saying, I went and I worked and I
Mhm.
supported myself because I didn't want to take any money from you. I wanted to have a good reputation among you. And then he uses that to defend his position in Second Corinthians. So it's important to know that he worked while he was there. And it's interesting. Again, scholars kind of disagree on a lot of this. What was Priscilla and Aquila's status? And I am very much on your side, John. I think because of the house they had in other places, they're wealthy. But another thing you can see when you're in Corinth, so now we're in the site visit, we have two large areas where these shops are still somewhat standing. And what would happen is people who worked in these shops, underneath the stoa, right next to the forum, they would work down below and then stay in the space that's over their shop, kind of like a lofted area. And so, is this the situation that Paul finds himself in, living above the shop, then working in the tin shop below? A lot of that is subject to debate, but you do get a good picture of these shops when you go to Corinth, because there's a lot of remains that are still there.
Yeah.
So the next thing we find in the text is that Paul, as was his custom, is going to reason in the synagogue. And we've talked about in previous episodes that synagogues are kind of an archaeological hallmark. Can we find a synagogue there? Was there a synagogue there? So, John, was there a
Well,
synagogue in Corinth?
quick answer again, one has not been discovered, but there is an inscription in the museum, and a marvelous museum there. It's not huge. It's not all air conditioned, by the way, in every place in there, but a great museum. And in that museum, there is an inscription that has reference to a synagogue belonging to the Jews. And so, as with so many situations, most of these sites are not excavated, but only like maybe 10% or something. I mean, when you visit Corinth and the archaeological site there, you're only visiting the inner part of the city where the forum was and where some of the temples were. I mean, it's still a massive site and huge, and it's awesome to visit the site. We'll talk more about it in a second, but as you're leaving the site, what you realize is that there are houses all around, and when we were there last, this guide was telling us, he goes, yeah, these people back here were, digging in their backyard, and they found something. I mean, in other words, there are houses there has to be the remains of houses all over the place underneath these modern homes that they're not going to dig under for various reasons. Um, so could the synagogue have been out a little bit further out? Probably so, whatever. But yeah, so Paul goes there, and I think it's interesting, as you're going to maybe identify here in a second, even though I know we need to divide our time between looking carefully at the text and talking about what people see when they go there, but still a lot of interesting connections between this Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, and then later on we've got another ruler of the synagogue. What's happening here? So anyway, go ahead.
Well, and there's two pieces of evidence. So the inscription says assembly place, or do you know if it actually says synagogue and the assembly is just
Yes,
translated?
it's a
Yeah.
partial. I mean, it's been lopped off, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
the word for Hebrew, is like it looks like HEB. I sent a I took a photo of that and sent it to my daughter-in-law who works for HEB, the food stores here, Henry E. Butt food stores in Texas. And I said, "Look, there was an HEB here," and so yeah. Anyway, part of that word for Hebrew is there. Yeah.
And then the other evidence is there is a column capital that very clearly has menorahs on it. And I saw a picture of that. So hopefully, if we can get a picture that isn't copyrighted, we'll put that on the in the show notes. But
Yeah, I think I
very
have a photo.
clearly,
I think I have a photo of it. I'll send it to you.
I think
Yeah.
I have a video of it. But we'll get one of those. But that is there's no doubt about that. You look at that and you said that's a menorah, and it's on a column capital. So
Yeah.
uh, evidence of a synagogue there. So very interesting. I do want to. I feel like it bears mentioning, but we won't mention it too much. Both Crispus and Sosthenes are listed as the leader of the synagogue or the ruler of the synagogue. Um, Lots of different explanations for that. I think the easiest one in my mind is that Paul was there for 18 months at
Mhm.
least. And so it makes perfect sense that more than one ruler could come along. Um,
Absolutely.
in my mind, I don't know that this is a valid line of thinking. Maybe, John, you can correct me here. But the other thing is, it says that Crispus was a believer, he was converted. I don't know how long they're going to let him continue to be the ruler of the synagogue. And so it makes even more sense that Crispus was converted and then maybe got the boot as the leader of the synagogue. And so Sosthenes is the leader of the synagogue or the ruler of the synagogue in verse 17. So I don't want to
Yeah.
say much more about that, but
Well, I will just add this is interesting. I was reading through this again the other day, of course, and it seems like Sosthenes, because he was beaten, that maybe he was also had accepted Christ, right, and became a Christian. So
well, and I again, the text doesn't say, and so since you mentioned it, it's good to bring up. They see Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal, or we'll talk about what that means in a second. But one of two possibilities, right? One is exactly what you're saying. He's become converted, and now they're beating him. I think that there's a possibility, although maybe not probably, that they got their rulers of the synagogue confused, and Sosthenes, who was not a believer, got beaten anyway.
yeah,
Um,
which would be well, I sound sadistic, but almost funny. But anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, it would be funny if it wasn't beating, right? But they got the wrong guy, and they said, "Well, any guy's good enough." So
But the
that
only problem with that is that I asked that same question, but in verse 16 it says, "And he drove them from the tribunal." Well, the them then the pronoun has reference to the Jews that. So it's the
right.
Jews. Now it could be that the Jews still, some of them didn't know who the ruler was. I don't know, but anyway, yeah.
Well, and yeah, like I said, it's all of that is speculation, but again, fun to
Uh,
kind of think about what could have
yeah.
been going on.
But it's an
Um,
example of the power of the gospel changing people, and or that there were many Jews. I mean, some Jews that were had honest hearts that were seeking and looking, just like Paul himself. Eventually left Judaism proper and became a New Testament Christian. Right? Always appreciated his heritage, his roots, of course, and understanding the connection between Christianity and Judaism, and that in a relationship, and that Christianity grows out of Judaism as God's plan, right? But the fulfillment of it.
well, and the power of the gospel to change these people, and also, so Sosthenes, and I don't know how to say this exactly right, but Acts is kind of a violent book when you think about all the people that get beaten or driven or whatever. And Paul is usually the subject of that. And I don't want to minimize that Sosthenes gets beaten here, but very interestingly, Paul receives a vision during his time in Corinth, and there's no connection to an archaeological fact, but it's worth mentioning, I think, just in terms of the text and what's going on. The Holy Spirit comes and tells Paul to stay here, and he is not going to be persecuted here. And that is must have been such a relief because we've already talked about all the places he's come from, right? He's driven out of Thessalonica, he's driven out of these other places. We've talked about how he was treated in Athens and everything, and he gets to Corinth and he's given a reprieve. And I think that's such an interesting thing, but it's also interesting to me that it's in a place that has such a reputation, right? They have such a reputation for immorality, and yet the Holy Spirit tells Paul, "You need to stay here and you need to preach to these people." And there's a lot of people in this city that are my people, and they're going to take care of you, and you're not going to have to endure this persecution for a time. So, anything more you want to say about that?
No, no, one of the things I want us to be sure to do, though, of course, is to talk about more about what's at that site and these connections here, because there are some really cool things that people are going to experience when they go to this site, or I need to know about. Maybe they could never visit the site themselves, but as you mentioned, so many powerful things. So let's keep going.
All right. Well, one more thing because we're almost done walking through the text. So, again, encourage you to read that on your own. But the ESV says that when the Jews kind of, got their feathers ruffled as they usually did, they took Paul and brought him before the tribunal. I'm not a Greek guy. I probably didn't have to tell our regular listeners that. But the Greek word for tribunal is what?
Bema. Well, the Erasmian pronunciation. Yeah, yeah.
So, what is, let's talk a little bit about the Bema and what that is. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, and think about in most cities, I've seen evidence of it in various places that we've been, like Ephesus. I mean, Philippi for sure. Athens, there's a small one there, but it's a raised area where the governor of the city, or the ruler of the city would come, and maybe there had been official rulings were given from this raised area. So it's sort of like a courtroom outdoors in a sense. I'm sure it was covered to some degree, but this one at Corinth is particularly large and beautiful. Um, Even though the marble on the side of it has been robbed and used in other places over the ages, but the remains of this large foundation that's probably, I think, around 8 feet high. If you're standing on the ground and you can barely kind of reach up and touch the base of it. It's just a raised area where magistrates came to hear cases, to maybe judicial proceedings that maybe had to do with of a civic matter like this one.
Yeah. And we talk, and I think we try to make special emphasis of a place where Paul actually stood. And now there's grass and dirt and that kind of thing. So we're in the neighborhood. But if they brought Paul before, and I don't know about you, but the word tribunal to me, I get the idea of a council. The word bema, though, gives us an idea of a place and
Ex-
a situation.
Exactly.
So this bema is still there in Corinth, and it's right there in the forum. And so this is one of the places where you can go, and I can't put my finger on a rock, but I can say Paul would have stood right here in this general area because the bema is here, and this is where they would have brought him to discuss these matters. Um, I, we're always. I want to make one quick connection between what they said when they brought him to the bema. It says this man is persuading people to worship God contrary to the law. Well, the law in that case is going to be the Roman law. Remember that there are authorized religions, and then there are tolerated religions, and then there are illegal religions. Well, the Jews are using their political savvy once again to try to get the Romans involved with persecuting Paul. Gallio, Galileo, the proconsul of Achaia. We'll talk about him in just a second, but I think he sees through this attempt by the Jews. He dismisses it. He's going to turn a blind eye to the situation, considering it just a Jewish matter. But as things progress, the Jews use their political savvy to get the Romans involved so that the Romans no longer see Christianity and Judaism as a one religion. They see them as separate religions. But we see the seeds of that right here. They're trying to get the Romans involved by saying Christianity is an illegal religion and it's contrary to the law. So,
Mhm.
interesting point there. Well, let's talk about Gallio.
Hey, before you move on there,
Yeah, go ahead.
there is a, on top of that, Bayman, you can go up there, it's really cool, and walk around on top of there, and remember, as you've just mentioned, Paul is brought there standing before this bema before, Gallio, and others are beaten, but he's having to give a defense in a sense, right? And as he would on many occasions. But on top of there is an inscription, and if you go there, you want to be sure and get a picture of it. But it's from Second Corinthians when Paul spoke about our light affliction, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, 14 through 16, when he spoke about our light affliction worketh for us a far more exceeding eternal weight of glory. And Paul was afflicted, he was persecuted, and I find that very powerful to see that particular verse and reminding us that, yeah, whatever you endure, whatever struggles, whatever tumult that happens as a result of living the Christian life, Paul, in writing a letter to the church at Corinth, maybe even thinking about that very event, says, look, whatever we go through in this life doesn't even compare to the eternal weight of glory that waits us. So anyway.
And it is very, like I said, very impactful and very neat to find those things kind of in the situation.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Gallio, and there's actually an archaeological record at Delphi or Delphi that talks about him, and then the remaining section of our time we'll go through the site and the museum and what we can see there. So archaeologically, there's a lot that we can find, but the Gallio inscription is actually found in Delphi or Delphi, and it tells us specifically what years this man Gallio was the proconsul in Achaia. And the text says that they brought him to Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. So pretty much everything we know about Paul's timeline, the timeline of when he was here and when he was in other places, hinges on this one detail that we find between the inscription we find in Delphi and the text we find in Corinth. And he is there when, John?
Well, so yeah, around 51. And the interesting thing about all that, you're right, is so significant. It's a small pieces of it, about 5 pieces of inscription that have been put back together that were discovered there at Delphi. And remember, I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast that Delphi is a part of this province that he is proconsul over. Now, proconsuls usually served about a year only. They were appointed, and their service was about a year, and the inscription actually makes reference to how many years it had been into the Emperor Claudius's rule, and basically the inscription is just saying uh, to Galileo, I want you to repopulate Delphi. Delphi is kind of, was once a very popular city among the Greek people, obviously, the Delphi of Oracle of Delphi there. And so, as a part of one of your missions is to get people to come back here to see it as a significant site, and that I think there was like a tax break or something that went along with people that could go there, and so because it mentions how many years into Claudius's reign, and then based on other benchmarks in the Roman record, we know what year that was. And so, as you mentioned, it becomes then quite fixed as to when Paul was at Corinth because of the short time that Galileo is going to serve as the proconsul there. And then from there, it's sort of like looking at this historical timeline at the middle. Okay, we've got a date now, a sort of benchmark that we can now. So if he spent 18 months here. All right. How long is it then before he's going to end up at Ephesus? And so, oh, now, okay, if he's there at Ephesus and he writes this letter, so now we can date the Corinthian letter, right? And then go backwards in time as well. So, yeah, it's hugely important and quite significant.
And, again, exactly what you're saying is that it's cool that we kind of estimate sometimes, actually, not sometimes, we estimate almost all the time. We estimate when a letter is written. We estimate when Paul was somewhere. This is as close to Paul writing the date on his arrival as you're gonna be able to get.
Yeah, I
Uh,
like that, I like that, and the fact that Luke mentions specifically who's the proconsul serving here matches up perfectly with the archaeological record.
and that's exactly right. So, very, very cool inscription, and again, you kinda gotta go to 2 places to get it. You got Delphi, the inscription, and then Corinth, the place, but
Hey, which by the way, a little anecdote about that, right? Do you remember did you visit the museum when you were there?
in Delphi or in
In
Corinth?
Yeah, Delphi.
Yeah, 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 Delphi.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah, Delphi, right? We say Delphi, they say Delphi there. So, uh, you remember you go through this awesome museum, it's beautiful. You got all these wonderful statues and inscriptions and artifacts and all of that, and then as you're about to leave, tucked away on the side, buried in a very unsort of, or in a very conspicuous sort of way, is this inscription. I was like, "Are you kidding me?" And they don't and I think I was so disappointed, and then, by then everybody's tired and everybody's trying to crowd around in there to see it, and then, "Okay, we gotta go," It's like because it's at the end of the,
I
end
do
of the
remember, yeah,
process.
it's right
Yeah,
there at the end.
yeah. Yeah, and, anyway, so I was kinda hoping there to be, behind glass case with all these lights and a guard standing there and all that, but it's not, so
It's just it is kind of out of the way right there at the end,
yeah,
so yeah,
yeah,
it's funny that that's the case.
yeah.
Alright, I wanna talk about the site visit and what you can see and what's there. One of the things that we haven't mentioned yet, like many ancient cities, Corinth has an acrocorinth, right? Remember that means high city, or they have an acropolis. Acropolis is high city. But Corinth is actually pretty interesting because it is so pronounced. I think it's 1,800 feet above the main city, which that's massive. And so it sticks out. You can see it from everywhere, but there's not a lot up there right now. We didn't go up there. For one, we would have had to walk, and that's a long way up. But there's not a ton that you can see, but it would have been a lot like the Acropolis in Athens or in other cities we've talked about. Um, and so there is a high city that I have not been to. Then there's kind of this mid city and massive Roman Forum, all these shops, that kind of thing. We'll talk about that in a second. But then kind of it's across the main road now, and you go down a set of stairs, there's a field, and in that field, there's a very, very important inscription, and it's in Latin, and it talks about this man named Erasmus. So, John, you want to talk a little bit about the Erasmus inscription?
Erastus with a T, Erastus.
Erastus, excuse
Yeah,
me. I wrote
yeah,
my
yeah.
I
I've been
wrote
telling
auto.
you the Erasmian pronunciation with
Yeah,
regard to
no,
reading.
I think
I got it in your
autocorrect
head.
got me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I first of all, let's maybe tell the story. I remember reading something about this course years ago. It was actually a discovery made in 1929, and it gets referenced in a lot of Christian evidence apologetics, circles and works and all of that. But it just doesn't. It didn't ring a bell with me that, oh yeah, we're going to actually see it in the ground, or I didn't even remember all the connections exactly. But the first time we went there, and we start heading down this hill before we even go into the main part of the archaeological site, uh, that's all closed off and you have to pay to get in. We start heading down the hill to what was the remains of this theater. You can't really make out that it's a theater, or we just, if you read about it and you read the archaeological record, or the guide tells you, you can see it off in the distance there. But you start heading down this hill, and then imagine this sort of uh, grassy area with the remains of large stones from previous buildings kind of scattered around here and there. And then you go up to this little flat area where there is this small thin cable on these four posts, right, in a square surrounding something that you can easily step over. I mean, it's sagging. It's just one small thin cable, right? And um, and the first time I saw it, our guide went down there and he starts brushing off the dirt off of this piece of stone slab. And on this stone slab are these. this carving indentations of these Latin words that once were filled with bronze. At least they feel like, and is erasing it off, and then you're like, okay, it's in Latin. What is it? You can make out the word Erastus, but then there are also other Latin words referring to a particular office held by this man Erastus, and then some abbreviations associated with his name and what he did. But basically, it's an honorific inscription describing what this man Erastus, who was, and it uses a Latin word that you see translated in Greek as oikodomos, as a sort of ruler of a steward of some sort of the city, or it gets translated as treasurer in a number of other English translations. But it's the Latin word that has reference to someone who had the responsibility of sort of public works, of maintaining the city's treasury, and water, roads, things like that. And evidently, this man Erastus had paved a section of the road in this area at his own expense. Okay, so he's going to endear himself to the people. He's collecting taxes. He's using he's probably a pretty wealthy individual anyway because of his position, and now to endear himself to the people, as we see today, people sometimes donate money for particular public service areas that need improvement, a park or whatever. He did the same thing. And now there's some debate about if this stone was found in secondary use, or in other words, they'd use it as a piece of pavement years later after it was already inscribed in the first century on some wall or whatever. But still, it just boggles your mind. Here is this inscription over 2,000 or roughly 2,000 years old, on the ground, grass growing over it, dirt in it, and you have to scrape it away to see it. It should be in a museum, but it's not. It's in situ, how the archaeologists found it. But the significant part of all this is that, as you've mentioned, when you read in Romans 16 about Paul making reference to a man by the name of Erastus, who was a city treasurer, uses the Greek word that's identical to the Latin word that's found there at that text. You go, okay. And Paul mentions him as a brother in Christ. This has got to be him. Now, can we say 100% without doubt that this man Erastus mentioned here in this inscription is the exact same one in Romans 16? Okay, no, I don't know that you can say 100%, but I think you're about 99.99% sure. In other words, this is verisimilitude that we've been talking about. You read of names and titles and people in Scripture. What do you find in the archaeological record? Okay, there is this match that occurs, and so yeah, very, very powerful testimony to Scripture.
Yeah, and I want to follow that up with the idea that this name Erastus is not all that popular in antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
So if it said Gaius, well, we'd have a big problem because there's like 40 million of those. I mean, they're all over the place. But Erastus is actually kind of a unique inscription, and I think, I was trying to think of a unique name from our history, but if in 1,000 years somebody finds a piece of paper or a fragment or inscription in America that refers to Condoleezza, I think they're going to be able to put that to Condoleezza Rice, who was the defense secretary for a minute,
Yeah,
right?
Brian, we're going to have another problem with, though, right?
Yeah, Brian, there's 4 million.
John.
John Moore, I know like 6 John Moores.
Yeah, yeah,
But, you find one of these kind of unique names and it,
yeah,
especially if it says government official Condoleezza, you're like, okay, I know which one we're talking about.
yeah.
So to find Erastus in Romans talking about the city treasurer, and then to find Erastus in Corinth talking about this same word in Latin, there's a lot of credibility to exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I guess people could argue, well, it could have been a son or someone else, but like you said, what are the chances of that? But now, what is even to me then indisputable is that Paul uses a word that definitely references, although, in our Greek text, it's the Greek word for it, but that exactly reflects what the governmental agencies were that were in existence. One of the like 7 or 8 that were in charge of a particular city under the Roman Empire, and this was one of them. So, um, wow, you can trust your Bible.
I do want to make one other quick mention. So John mentioned that it's in Greek and Roman and in Latin in Corinth. This is coming full circle to something I said at the outset. The inscriptions in this city are in Latin, which is unique. And the more you travel and the more you look, the less you see in Latin. You see almost everything in Greek. So very Roman, very interesting about that. I did forget this, but Latin and English use the same characters, right? So it's a little more fun if you don't know any Greek, you're going to have a hard time identifying words as you go through the Mediterranean, right? Because
Mhm.
they don't use the same alphabet and whatever. But you can identify some Latin words. You can
Yeah,
look and you look in the ground and you're like, oh, that says Erastus. I can
it
see
does. Yeah,
exactly.
yeah,
So pretty cool. And then you're talking about the HEB. I was like, well, in Greek it would look different, but no, it is in Latin, and it
yeah,
says HEB very clearly for
yeah.
Hebrew. So, kind of interesting. Okay, John. So I want to kind of moving on from the Erastus inscription. I want to continue our going through the site, and we're going to go through these quickly. I think we'll have an opportunity to do more videos, more content. It's a good opportunity to talk about our website and the articles that are on there. So we have a few articles already on the Bible Passages site about this. John's writing an article this week about head coverings that'll be released well before this episode gets to you. So check out our stuff and make sure you're subscribed and like us on YouTube and that kind of thing so that you can get the most up to date information. But with that being said, I'm just going to run blitz through some of the things that you can see. Um, in the site itself, you have a Roman city, very large Roman forum. The most prominent thing that you can see at the site is the Temple to Apollo. If you've seen any picture of Corinth, even on our website, that is the poster image that they use. One of the books that I have, it's on the front cover. That temple to Apollo is very prominent on the landscape. We've talked a lot about him in other episodes,
Well, and
but
just mention, Brian, when you say it is prominent, you're right, but how much of it's really standing?
about 6 columns.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
So it is, you see it as the first thing, but it's not the Parthenon by any stretch of the imagination.
yeah, yeah.
But it is the most prominent thing you see. We mentioned the museum several times. The museum at Corinth is very, very good. It's not huge, but there's a ton that you can see in there. Again, many inscriptions are in Latin, so it's a little more fun because you get to read some things that you could read in English. Um, I do want to mention a room in the Corinthian Museum. We may have to have a whole episode dedicated to Asclepions, but they are the hospitals of the ancient world slash health spas slash uh, temple worship. They are all encompassing, but it reminds us that if you wanted healthcare in the first century, you couldn't escape the idolatry even in healthcare. They were often mixed together. The very prominent one in Turkey, but also in Corinth, there was an Asclepion there. And again, I think the word hospital or health club. And what people would do is they would come and they would receive treatment. And if they were healed, they would return a votive offering, a voluntary offering. And they would typically try to do that in the shape of the body part that was healed. So
Mhm.
there are hands, there are feet, there are other parts that are
Other parts. That's a good way of thinking. Other parts.
that are found in the temple or in the museum there.
Yeah.
So very, very cool.
Which, by the
Um,
way, it makes you wonder if there was some connection, between that and what Paul was saying in, 1 Corinthians about our were you going to mention something about that? That just always brings to
No,
mind
go
about
ahead.
how
Go ahead.
there are many members, right? Many
Yeah.
parts, but one body. And so I think that they could have, said, "Oh yeah, we get that part because all these body parts that are found everywhere, and yeah, but there's really only one body." But anyway, go ahead.
Um, kind of moving on in that museum, there's several uh, busts or heads of emperors and that kind of thing. We didn't talk about this, and I can't get into it too much, but city has a very strong connection to Julius Caesar. He was actually murdered kind of in the height of that relationship, but there's a very strong connection to him, and when he was deified, uh, there's some connections to that. So lots of connections to the emperors
I
and
think
busts
there's a
to them.
Julian Basilica there, isn't there? Right? The
Yeah,
remains of
yeah,
it, right?
uh,
Hmm.
yep.
Yeah.
I think that's right. So um, very cool, John. I want to give you kind of the final two comments here. One, I want you to talk about the stuff that I missed on the site. So what else can you see there? And then, what kind of connections can be made to those things?
Yeah. Well, so as you mentioned, the museum inside of it, I think if you want to, proceed to the things that like mirrors, they found a mirror in that era, or at least the bronze statue part of it or the base of it that would have held the reflective material associated with it. But Paul makes reference to a mirror. So artifacts that are there that give us some idea about the daily life and practices of the ancient world, how really modern they were, and then how that Paul uses some of those objects to um, drive home the point about various spiritual principles and thoughts. Even the Apostle John in the Book of Revelation speaks about the bowls of wrath being poured out as a form of sort of a libation. Like, well, there are bowls from temples that have been found that are preserved there at Corinth. And another thing that is highly significant that we'll reserve for a greater discussion, but I want to mention it here, is a statue of both Nero and also of Augustus that are veiled. That, in other words, they have some sort of head covering over the top of their head, and these emperors were sometimes depicted. Some of them were in various ways, either as militaristic or maybe as sort of like a philosopher or citizen, as a leader, but then sometimes also as the priest who mediated on behalf of the people. And as they offered up their sacrifices at some of these temples, they would veil themselves, and they weren't the only ones that did this. So men, sort of a custom of veiling yourself as a paganistic practice, and there's a lot of reasons associated with that. But so when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 about men not covering themselves, maybe there's a connection there, and I believe there is, that we will discuss later. So you see that. You want to be sure and pay attention to that when you go through that museum. Um, as far as the site, yeah, there are the remains of the Temple of Apollo. There's also a place called Temple E that some say was dedicated to Octavia, which was the sister of Augustus, and that also represented there a place for Romans to come and worship that was connected to Capitoline Hill and the triad of gods, Juno, Minerva, and who was the fourth one? Um, always forget, Jupiter. The three gods worshipped on Capitoline Hill in Rome. Their most important gods worshipped there. So you've got that. You've got the Bema that we've already mentioned. You've got remains of a theater, and then the shops up and down. And then there was by the way, in the museum, there's an inscription that has reference to the meat market. Well, that plays right again to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, right? And Paul talking about eating meats sacrificed to idols. But the last thing that you want to be sure you see, and I think a lot of people don't get to see it at the site, is a little further east of the Bema is a sort of you know area that's been excavated down to the Greek period. So you've got the Roman Forum that was laid over the top of this Greek era city, but from that Greek era city, there are the remains of these starting blocks. as it were. So there used to be a running track in this area of the forum, and uh, in etched into the stone are these little notches where people would put their feet, and they're kind of offset a little bit, like you can imagine starting blocks that people use today, and their feet are offset just a little bit at the at the starting line. They had those in the ancient world, and I've seen lots of videos and read lots of things about these series of starting blocks etched into stones, and how they had a rope across the front. It would all fall down at the rope would, and they could all leave at the same time. And but those have been found there. So what's the point? Paul draws in these letters upon the practices of the ancient world, and uses those practices as imagery for things connected to the Christian life, especially in the book of Corinthians. We've already noted one from 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in the Bema. We shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, just like Paul had to stand before a judgment seat on more than one occasion. We're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and have to give an answer for the things that we've done in the flesh. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, you mentioned, Brian, earlier about the temple of Aphrodite, and she was the goddess of beauty and the goddess of love. And there's a lot associated with that that's even controversial among biblical scholars about the implications of that in regard to the cultural practices of the day, and what was going on there. Was there prostitution occurring and so forth? But I'll mention this, that one of her supposed children was a son by the name of Eros, and Eros is a name for love. Well, we know in the Greek language there's more words than just Eros for love. There is what Paul uses and what Jesus uses as agape, and then also phileo. And in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul talks about what true love really is. It's not that which is exemplified by some pagan god and her characteristics, an outward beauty, but rather true love has to do with doing and loving and forgiving, and not counting our people's mistakes against them and so forth. So that beautiful passage in 1 Corinthians 13, I think, can be understood and appreciated more against the backdrop of the temple of Aphrodite. And then, and many other ones like the head covering I mentioned. But the last one I want to end with is the one about the starting blocks in the race, the Isthmian games that we've already mentioned. Remember, Brian, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, that Paul made reference to these athletic competitions. And he said in verse 24, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable one. Well, that word perishable wreath, do you know that in those Greek games, what crown was given to the athlete? Well, it was different in different places. Sometimes it might be a laurel wreath or an out of olive branches, but this one at Corinth was made out of celery, of all things. Celery. And there's a story connected to the snake, a python that was killed there, like at the one at Delphi, there at Corinth, and Poseidon, how he anyway, and came out of the bushes. Somebody came and strangled it with celery or whatever. I don't remember all the facts of the story, but that became the symbol of someone who won a prize. Well, Paul said these perishable crowns, right, they're perishable, they don't last. But we're running the Christian race, and the crown that we will receive in the end is imperishable, right? So run as only one may win that prize. And I don't know, do you have any thoughts about the race that we're running today and the struggles that we face, and kind of what people are striving to have? And
Well, I do. The first thing that has to be out of the way is, if the prize is celery, then I'm not competing. Um,
yeah,
you can kill snakes with it. You can put it in a crown. Just whatever you're going to do, not to eat it. It's
yeah,
not a. But I think it's really interesting, and this was actually pointed out in one of our Bible classes recently. That section, I think, often gets taken out of context, and I do believe that it is uh, somewhat standalone, in that it can apply to a lot of situations in our life. Right? We don't run aimlessly. Well, other places that talks about running, I think about Hebrews chapter 12, lay aside every weight and run with endurance the race that's set before us. But it's in a section where Paul is talking about his liberty and what liberty he doesn't exercise to make sure that he doesn't offend anybody. And he uses these things. He says that I discipline my body to keep it under control. Basically, I do work, right? I work with Priscilla and Aquila. I do make sure that if people are offended by me eating meat, then I don't eat meat. I make sure that I go out of my way to practice self-discipline so that nobody is offended by what I do with my life. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of discipline. And we talk about in America a lot of times the rugged individualism and the pull yourself up by your bootstraps and the uniquely individual way that our culture operates. Well, Paul says the exact opposite. He says, I'm going to work like an athlete works to train myself to make sure that I don't offend anybody. And I think that's a incredibly powerful section.
Well, and that translates over into so many relationships, doesn't it? Like with marriage or in the church, and thinking about maybe our problem isn't today eating meats, but it may have to do with other things that people might have a problem with in the body of Christ that they're really struggling with, and that we may see, well, that's fine, it's okay, we believe we have biblical authority for it, but let's not run over everybody. Let's think about this and restrain ourselves. And yeah, I mean, that's such a great point. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, and I think there's one more point out of that section, and it goes into everything that we're talking about. He's making a point that's incidental to the meat offered to idols, and he says, do you not know that those who participate in the feast are participants with the altar? And he says, I don't want you to become participants with idols. And we've talked a lot about how our idols are not stone and wood and gold and that kind of thing. Our idols are more metaphorical or more philosophical. Well, the question is, are we eating at the table of idols today? And I think those two things go together. Those are the extremes, right? Am I disciplining my body? Am I bringing it under subjection? Am I making sure that I'm not offending anybody? Or am I eating at the table of the idol of selfishness or materialism or whatever? And I think those are the contrasts in lifestyle that Paul gives. So,
Yeah. Great points. Great points.
John, it's great to be with you. Really enjoyed Corinth. Really enjoy visiting Corinth, and hope everybody got a lot out of this discussion. And we will see you next time on the Bible Passages podcast. God bless. John and I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Bible Passages podcast. One of the missions of Bible Passages is to deliver as much free Bible content to people as possible, but we can't do that without your support. First, you can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or on YouTube. Second, you can leave a comment on this video or this episode so that we know that you're listening. And third, if you feel compelled to give, you can do so at BiblePassages.net/give. Thank you so much for your support, and we'll see you in the next episode.